Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Close Up, coming to you from Jerusalem. I'm Leah Zinder. And this week, an unusual perspective on Close Up. We'll be hearing from a distinguished and, as I say, unusual list of guests who'll be giving us their views on the changing face of the Middle East. They are guests of the prestigious Herzliya Conference, where leaders and academics, many from countries not often represented here, meet at the IDC in Herzliya in an open and often heated exchange of ideas. At the conference, I met and interviewed the director of the Doha Brookings Center in Qatar, a professor from a university in Istanbul, Turkey, a senior journalist from India, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Professor Uri Rosenthal, who is the son of Holocaust survivors. But first, I'm especially pleased to welcome to our close-up studio Professor Gerald Steinberg, who also was at the Herzliya Conference this week, a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Steinberg is the executive director of NGO Monitor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Leah.
And before we go into our first interview, let's kick off by my asking you how you see the delegitimization of Israel from your study of NGOs around the world, and especially in Europe, of course.
One might have thought or hoped that with everything going on in Egypt and the rest of the Arab world, that organizations that claim to promote human rights, humanitarian aid, would realize that human rights are really being violated by those regimes and focus on them. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The attacks against Israel, the delegitimization on these false war crimes, the work of Richard Goldstone and others continues, and in fact we're having the Human Rights Commissioner from the UN, Navi Pillay, coming this weekend, and I think she's very much part of that problem of hijacking that agenda of human rights against Israel.
Okay, well, given what you've just said, Gerald, I'll be interested in your response to this first interview, which, as I say, was with the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Professor Uri Rosenthal, who is Jewish, and the son of parents who fled the Netherlands during the Holocaust. Let's hear what he had to say to me following a panel discussion entitled, "Is Israel Losing Europe?"
Well, I would hope that when you say that you want to counter Israel bashing and efforts of some to delegitimize Israel, if you want to counter that, I think that you should get an open ear for the criticism you might have in the direction of Israel. And when I'm talking about criticism, I would not say it is criticism, it's just the point of view which the Dutch government takes on, for instance, the Middle East peace process. What we want to happen is to go for a two-state solution. We want to have the pre-June 67 borders. We want a negotiated arrangement for the capital, Jerusalem. And let's face it, the Dutch government, as many other governments, considers the settlements to be illegal and no contribution to the peace process. If you would consider that to be criticism, okay, it is criticism, but it is criticism in the direction of a friend, namely the State of Israel.
Now, sir, it's well known that you yourself are Jewish. You are the son of Holocaust survivors. Your parents fled the Netherlands during the Second World War. Does this affect your policies? I know that many people in the Netherlands say that it does.
I don't think it influences my policies, my attitude, my orientation. What I am talking about is simply the fact that the State of Israel is a state which has been recognized throughout more than 60 years. 1948, the birth of the State of Israel. Israel is a state. It should be recognized in its rights and in its duties. And there is no reason for me to consider that to be part of my Jewish background or the Jewish heritage.
According to the Jerusalem Post, the Dutch government is funding something called the Electronic Intifada, a virulently anti-Israel organization that sends speakers across the world to speak at Israel Apartheid Weeks.
That the Dutch government itself would fund a website called Electronic Intifada is a short-circuited remark. It's somewhat more complicated, somewhat more intricate. What actually happens is that there is a NGO which is sponsored by the Dutch government, which uses its own donations to give support to this website. Now, I have talked to this NGO in a critical manner. I have asked them to reconsider their position. That is what this is all about at the moment.
Okay. Professor Steinberg, you are familiar, I know, with the electronic Intifada website. Were you satisfied by the minister's reply?
Within the framework of a lot of politically correct European responses, that was pretty good. He did acknowledge that indirectly, but very significantly, the Dutch government does fund this very virulent organization. It's not just a website. It also does have officials that do travel to the United States, to Europe, promoting the Israel as Apartheid framework, Israel Apartheid Week, and other things. It's one of many, many organizations funded by European governments, directly and indirectly. In this case, the Dutch government gives 130+ million euros to a church organization called ICO, which is supposed to provide humanitarian aid, and some of that money is diverted towards electronic Intifada, very much hidden from public view. And it was our research that exposed that. That is repeated dozens, maybe hundreds of times by at least 15 other European countries. And I would hope that the Dutch foreign minister doesn't just fix the problem of electronic Intifada, but also so many other organizations that his and other governments are funding that help, in fact, exacerbate the conflict.
Right. And there is another point. You know, you heard Minister Rosenthal say to me, the fact that I'm Jewish and the son of Holocaust survivors does not in any way affect my policies towards Israel. The question is, it seems to me, should it not? Should not Europe, with its dark history, be doubly vigilant and doubly cautious when it comes to giving Israel advice as to how to proceed?
Certainly the issue, not just of giving Israel advice, but answering and basing its policy on sound bites, on politically correct sound bites. And I think I do take the Foreign Minister Rosenthal at his word. He is a friend of Israel. Mm-hmm. And many other people were here that were friends of Israel. But they don't understand the situation. They are very much locked in their own European framework, and almost everything that we heard from him and the other speakers in that session were based on those European distortions. That's also part of the NGO problem. It's part of the distortion of human rights. It's also the way in which they approach what they call the peace process without understanding how complex these issues are and what Israel really faces.
Okay. But it's not only Europe, of course, and we heard General James Jones saying at the conference, if God had told President Obama one thing, it would be for Israel and the Palestinians to move towards peace. What did you make of that very quickly before we go on?
It's interesting that James Jones, who has now resigned his position, made that statement sort of in place of God. And it tells you something about the American hubris in this process, but also what it shows that Jones was a failure in terms of his Middle East policies. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's dealt with, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, with the Israeli-Palestinian issues really did not only did they not succeed, but they set things back. There's completely false emphasis, and Jones was part of that problem in saying we have to do a freezing of settlements and other things, and really missing the essential issues.
Okay. Well, okay, we're going to take a little time out. We're going to go on to something even more controversial, the subject of Turkey and the steep decline in relations between Turkey and Israel, even before, but especially after the Mavi Marmara incident. One guest at the conference who took part in one of the more heated discussions was Professor Soli Özel, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Istanbul Bilgi University. He told me the high emotions in Israel over the Turkey issue do not surprise him.
I have a sense of the emotions and how hot they are, as I know how hot the emotions are in Turkey. I mean, after all, there is now blood between the two countries, and this is not just an ordinary disagreement over something. And
what will it take, if anything, to defuse the current crisis, in your view?
Well, I think the fires in Carmel gave a good opportunity to move beyond, and the two sides have met after Carmel, and they've almost reached an agreement. And Mr. Netanyahu, to the best of my knowledge, was committed to it. Turkish Prime Minister certainly was committed to it, and the Foreign Minister just decided to blow it.
It wasn't just
the Israeli Foreign Minister.
Right. It wasn't just the Foreign Minister. Israeli public opinion was also against it, because Israelis were saying, why should Israel apologize when it was a bunch of thugs who attacked unarmed Israeli soldiers aboard the Mavi Marmara?
That obviously is not the way it's seen in Turkey, and the Turkish public opinion was no less against reconciliation either. This is what politicians, if they're statesmen, do. That they do bite the bullet and move forward, because I think this kind of dissociation and estrangement is not something that Israel can afford, nor can Turkey for the long run. In the long run, should be so estranged from Israel. That's what statesmen are for. Otherwise, we could run the countries by neighborhood councils.
Now, the way Israel sees it, Turkey has turned its back on the West and is turning more and more towards Iran and towards an alliance with the Islamic world. Is that the way you see it?
No, and I will also ask, when was the last time the Turks have seen the face of the Europeans and not the back of the Europeans? So we've got to put things in proper context.
I think what Israel wants is to go back to the situation where Turkey was seen as a strong ally of Israel and a strong ally of the forces of democracy in the Middle East.
But the thing is, the Israelis also prefer a Turkey where the military had the final say. I don't like that Turkey, and Israelis will not get that Turkey for some time to come, if ever again. Hopefully ever again, never again. Therefore, they've got to get accustomed to the fact that Turkey is indeed a democratic country where the popular will has something to say about the conduct of foreign policy, and in that sense, it has always, the Palestinian issue has always been, from 1949 onwards, the Achilles heel of Turkish-Israeli relations, even in 1995. Okay? And so long as that issue is not resolved, it will be very difficult to actually bring the Turkish-Israeli relations to the situation that the Israelis would like to see that.
Okay, a lot to talk about there. Gerald, first of all, do you think that Israel is going to have to bite the bullet in order to get past the Mavi Marmara incident?
I don't think Israel has to bite the bullet in the sense of an apology. Certainly no apology is warranted. And I think we've gotten beyond that by having the interests determining the nature of the relationship, and the fact that Professor Ozal was here speaking frankly, and I think presenting a strong Turkish position and listening to the Israeli positions was extremely important. It was a heated discussion there, and it will continue to be heated discussions, but I think there are common interests that are working themselves out, and the Navi Marmara was a disaster. And it was something that was deliberately provocative. It was part of the delegitimization campaign. We also didn't hear the word Islam from Professor Ozal. He's a secular member of the elite within Turkey, but the leadership is very much part of the Islamist movement. And there was a lot of criticism. He's not going to voice it in an interview with IBA News, sitting in Herzliya at the conference, but I think that is part of the Turkish relationship that they have to work out themselves. Are we going to see more of Turkey as part of the Navi Marmara and the IHH terrorist organization and the values that they represent, with the support, again, of the UN Human Rights Commission and again of the Council and again of the NGO community? Or are we going to see that Turkey takes this much more seriously and doesn't allow repetition? That's an important factor in this process.
Right, and also I think he's absolutely right. He's not about Europe. I mean, Turkey signed its association agreement with the European Union almost 50 years ago, and Europe has turned its back on Turkey.
That is about Europe in the sense that the Turkish move towards the East, towards Islam, towards Iran, is to a significant degree part of the response to being rejected by Europe.
Right.
And in fact, we just had the Dutch foreign minister. We had a session on European-Israeli relations. Then we had Turkey-Israel. We should have also, the triangle would have had also how the European-Turkish hostility has really resulted in a major cost to Israel as a result.
Right. But it is interesting that from everything he said, it is clear that Turkey is interested in maintaining its ties with the West as well.
I think we have to be careful. We heard one voice, a very important voice, but certainly not representing the government, and probably someone who is not part of that government structure in the Islamist movement.
Okay. Thank you very much at this point. Well, it's not every day we have a guest from Qatar, but Salman Sheikh, director of the Brookings Doha Center, is in Herzliya for the conference, and he agreed to give us his perspective on the latest developments in the Middle East. Sheikh rejects the notion that countries like Qatar are watching the protest movement in Egypt with trepidation in the fear that it could unseat the ruling monarchy in his country.
No, I don't think so. I think His Highness the Emir and Her Highness Sheikh Hamoza, as well as the Prime Minister, Hamad bin Jassim, they have all followed a policy of trying to enact a certain vision which is focused on future generations, which has been focused on education, building the human capacity of the people in their country, and building modern states.
People here in Israel are arguing that President Obama's abandonment of Mubarak is sending a negative message to American allies across the Middle East. You say that's not the case?
Well, yes, I've seen the commentary about how, you know, the rug has been pulled under the feet of some of sort of long-standing allies, or how the Americans have caught the others with their pants down, etc. But what I would say to that is that there is criticism still the other way, that the American administration has still not done enough in terms of supporting the change. It has been more or less playing catch-up to the unfolding momentum that is going on in the streets of places like Cairo and Alexandria.
Let me ask you a question about the Qatari television station Al Jazeera, which has, of course, changed the face of the Middle East. And I'm interested in how a country like Qatar, which is not a democracy, allows Al Jazeera to broadcast the things that it does, which seem to be destabilizing many countries in the region. Or is this part of the Qatari regime's strategy for remaining in power?
Again, I probably find it difficult to answer this authoritatively. I think Al Jazeera decision was taken some time ago that you needed such a network, and you can see the popularity it has in the Arab world. If it was no good, it would have closed down probably quite a long time ago. And I guess it's no different to perhaps some of the networks that were established in Atlanta or in other places in terms of reaching out to a mass global audience. What is undeniable is that Al Jazeera, through its innovation and through the fact that it has such presence, not least, for example, in the Gaza war, or now in terms of Egypt, they have a huge number of correspondents covering the field. It is a place that people go to in order to be able to listen to what's going on and to get perhaps a different opinion. Whether or not it's part of the Qatari authorities' sort of general view, whatever it says, I'm not sure, I would be honest with you.
But certainly Al Jazeera does not criticize the Qatari regime, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay. It certainly does not criticize the Qatari regime, correct?
That was a very interesting interview, and the way he carefully danced around those issues.
Right.
Both in terms of being someone who is based in Qatar, but also obviously a Western orientation.
Right.
So it was he chose his words carefully on that. No, they don't criticize the Qatari regime, and they are a propaganda organ that mixes and has the facade of a news organization with a lot of propaganda. I can say that from someone who's been on and have also watched Israelis. Anytime they cover Israel, whatever Israeli they may have on, the scenes in the background are always manipulated, one-sided. And certainly they played a very central role in the Navi Marmara affair. They played a central role in the war crimes, the false claims of war crimes during the Gaza operation, that was also fed into the Goldstone process. So we see that over and over again.
Right, and interesting that they believe that their economic prosperity, not to say vast wealth, somehow insulates them from the risk that the destabilization could spread to their country.
I'm not sure that they think that, but they are trying to do whatever they can, as any regime needs to do, to protect themselves. And in some ways, Al Jazeera is part of that. Let's have everybody else in the Middle East focus on everybody else but us in Qatar.
Right.
And I think they've been successful in doing that. It's clever policy.
Very clever.
And
Very
it's
clever
probably
indeed.
good money-making
Yeah, and it reminds me of the policy of Saudi Arabia, at least in the past, where they allowed terrorist cells to operate on condition that they didn't operate inside.
Yeah, France did that for a while too, so that's not just an Arab thing. It shows you how important it would be to have a 24/7 or at least 24/6 Israeli channel out there.
Well, I thank you for saying that, and I agree with you completely on that point, for sure. Well, the last voice that we'll be hearing from the Herzliya conference this week is a much more hopeful one. It's from what many observers are calling one of the two rising superpowers of the 21st century, India. Amid the growing dissension and cooling off of relations between Israel and Europe, our trade with India soared above $4 billion last year, excluding our enormous defense exports to that country. In fact, according to Ms. Indrani Bagchi, diplomatic editor of the Times of India, common interests between the two countries, and those include combating terrorism, land disputes with neighbours, Muslim minorities. India's Muslim minority, by the way, exceeds 100 million. All that, combined with a strong democratic heritage, all that has led to Israel becoming one of India's closest allies in the world. That's what she told us. Let's hear her.
India has been traditionally close to asking for a Palestinian state. And I think for many years India did not have diplomatic relations with Israel. But since it started, which was in '92, I think relations have improved so dramatically and so quickly that it is, I think it's surprised everybody. I think we now have diplomatically one of the biggest relations with, the deepest relations with any other country outside.
That's very interesting. How do you explain the depth and the strength of the relations?
I think it comes from a lot of shared interests. I think we both countries live in two very difficult neighborhoods, and I think there is greater understanding of each other's difficulties.
Now, many people, of course, believe that the 21st century will be the century of China and India, that you are the rising powers in the world. Is that the way you see it as well?
It always surprises Indians when others describe us in this fashion, because while it has been about 15 years of good growth, economic growth, I think as Indians, we look at ourselves and we actually see the challenges much more, and we have a long way to go before we can really call ourselves a power.
Professor Steinberg, I know you've been involved in talks between Israel and India. Interesting, this alliance between the world's largest democracy and perhaps the world's smallest.
It's interesting, but there are a lot of commonalities, as we've just heard, and watching this and somewhat being part of this growth of ties and cooperation and consultation and expanded economic and security issues together over the last 15 years, it makes a lot of sense. We talked about, at the beginning, we talked about dealing with terrorism, particularly radical Islamic terrorism. India suffers from it. Israel suffers from it. Where can we work together? What can we learn from each other? There are very many other ways, including the exploration of space for relatively, not the top powers, but the second-tier powers is often described. There is a lot of cooperation on these and other kinds of issues. It is also a means of not being dependent exclusively on the United States, a sense that Europe just doesn't care about either of us. All those things are part of the process. It doesn't understand either country, is a better way of saying it. So these types of cooperative ventures are important. If you get on an El Al plane these days to Delhi or to Mumbai, or you go off to China, you see a lot of people who are there for business and for substantive issues as well as tourists.
Right.
And I expect that the type of growth that we see will continue for some time to come. The high-tech business is booming both in India and in Israel,
right.
Continues to be important.
Although, again, their ruling party has traditionally not been that friendly towards Israel and has been pro-Palestinian. Does that bring us back to what we started with at the beginning of this program, that movement in the peace process will further help ties?
I think the Indians are less concerned about that issue and are less fixated on it.
Right. In fact, that's what Ms. Bachi actually told us. She said they have enough problems of their own. They
exactly.
really don't.
And they understand they know that there's not going to be an India-Pakistan peace in the foreseeable future for the same reasons that our Arab neighbors are not ready to recognize and accept Israel, for very similar types of processes there. And so, yes, I think that we will see this continued development that goes outside of that kind of a framework that we've seen before. There is a lot of mutual understanding in this area.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect place at which to end this program, and we're out of time for this week. We'd love to hear from you. As always, our address, IBA News feedback@gmail.com. Thanks to producer Irene Carmel-Miller, to Dennis Zinn. Thank you very much, Professor Steinberg, for sharing your vast and wide-ranging knowledge with us. And special thanks to all of you for watching Close Up. I'm Leah Zinder. Until next Wednesday at the same time, Shalom from Jerusalem.